Tiana Shoei. I'm an executive, a reader, writer, entrepreneur, athlete, life coach, and energy. This is my podcast. Tiana Shoei ain't quite right. Join us as we laugh, learn, and live big. Hello, everyone. This is Tiana Shoei, and welcome to my podcast. Tiana Shoei ain't quite right. Thank you so much for tuning in. It really does mean so much to me that you're joining me on this journey, because that's what this is. If I ever profess to be an expert at anything other than, well, making mistakes, then I'm full of it. But all kidding aside, I do this, and my intention for this is just to give you a little food for thought, maybe a little bit of inspiration, and help us realize that we're on a journey of growth, right? And as our good friend Tony Robbins says, if you aren't growing, you're dying. And so this is just little tidbits of ways where we can grow. Now, today's topic was just kind of random, and I'll explain why in just a little bit, but it's around the idea of expectations. Now, I really begin to learn about expectations at a young age. All of us have been disappointed at some point in time. I mean, stop and think about right now a time in your life where you had expectations of something and they turned out entirely different. And we've talked about this in other podcast episodes. Sometimes those expectations are realistic. When somebody marries you and they say, I'm going to be faithful to you, you expect that they're going to be faithful to you because that's an agreement that you guys made together, right? Sometimes those expectations are unwritten. Maybe it's you expected something different from a job that you had and it didn't turn out, or you expected a situation to turn out a certain way and it didn't turn out the way you thought. And sometimes those expectations, like I said, come from agreement, and sometimes those expectations come from an internal expectation that you set yourself. Maybe it's a social code that you think everybody should adhere to, or maybe it's something commonly understood. For example, if you schedule a meeting and you say, we're going to meet at 12 o'clock, the expectation is that everybody's going to arrive at 12 o'clock or within a few minutes of 12 o'clock, right? Those are social expectations. But today I want to talk about those expectations that we impose upon ourselves and how we can manage those so we don't find ourselves disappointed. Because oftentimes when we're disappointed about things in our lives, it's because we had an expectation for them to be differently. And that, again, expectations aren't bad. It's just bad when, or let me rephrase this, they become problematic when our expectations drive our happiness. And so what I want to do is I want to kind of decompose this idea a little bit with you guys today, so that way we can rethink where we are disappointed in our life as a result of expectations. So as usual, we begin and end with a quote, and today's quote is from Lao. And I love this quote because it's simple. It's act without expectation. Very simple. Just act without expectation. So let me ask you, I want to ask you something. I want you to think about a time recently where you, either based on an agreement or social understanding or whatever it is, you had an expectation of something and it didn't turn out the way you thought, and you had a negative reaction as a result. And maybe that negative reaction was just an emotional reaction and you didn't say much to anybody or anything. You just kind of felt your feelings and you moved on. Maybe it was a very big reaction. It was a reaction where you decided to make a big change in your life. Maybe it was you had an employer who you had an expectation they were going to do something they didn't, so you quit your job. Whatever that looks like, it's going to be different for everybody. So I want you to think about that situation, and I want you to think about your reaction. And I want to ask you this question, even if your expectation was justified. And most of the time when we are disappointed about something, our expectation is 100% justified. But let me ask you this. I want you to think about the scenario. What would have happened to the way you reacted, or how would you have reacted differently if you had acted without any expectation? I'm not saying that expectation is bad. I don't want you to take that away from this question. But what I am saying is, and this kind of goes back to a principle that I talk about a good bit, life is 10% what happens to you and 90% how you respond. And so as you mature and grow, ideally, our responses become much more, I would say, middle of the ground, healthy. I know that it was interesting. I learned this concept reading Cal Newport's book, Deep Work, and he talked about in that book a study that they did where and I'm paraphrasing the study. Obviously Cal does a much better job in his book describing this, but the gist of what he was getting at is that they had a group of people watching images or watching something that were sitting under an MRI having their brain scanned. And essentially the types of images that they were playing were ones that would elicit strong emotional reactions. And what was fascinating about the study is that the people who were a little bit older had lesser emotional reactions to the images. And the younger you were, the higher your reactions were. And then they did further research to see that those people that had lower reactions to the situations were actually overall happier. And we talked about this in a prior episode where I talked about happiness being gratitude. And I say that happiness is a decision and not a set of circumstances. And so ideally, the more we mature and the older we get, the more that we understand the statement that emotions make great servants, but terrible masters. In other words, how can we learn to respond to situations that don't meet our expectations in a way that doesn't take a bad situation and make it worse? So I'm going to give you an example of a time that I recently had to deal with this. And I chose to just say, it was disappointing, but my only expectation really was that at the end of the ordeal. And I'll explain what that means in just a second. So as you guys know, I do this for nothing other than because I enjoy this. I enjoy getting behind the microphone and sharing this with you. And I hope to inspire you or just give you food for thought, if nothing else. I don't expect you to agree with everything I say. I listen to a lot of people a lot smarter than myself on a regular basis, and I don't always agree with them, or what they say doesn't always resonate with me, but I still learn from them. And I hope that's the same with you. I hope you pick apart some of the stuff I say and either make it your own or say, you know what, I'm going to, get rid of this. I don't agree with that, or that doesn't resonate with me. It doesn't matter. It's about thinking. It's about getting out of our own heads a little bit, right? That's ideally what we get from a podcast. So I had a situation where somebody who is rather famous reached out to me and said, "Hey, I want to be a guest on your podcast." And I thought, wow, that's phenomenal. Thank you. Yes. And the purpose was this person wanted to promote their product. And I thought, okay, that's great. So we had clear expectations up front, what the premise was, and this person sent me their product so I could take a look at it and get familiar with it. Now, it took me, I would say, no less than 20 hours of prep. And I was doing this all on nights and weekends, a lot of hard work to get familiar with this product. So when we got on the podcast and it was something that I thought you guys were really going to like, I would have done the groundwork and it would be a great interview. And so I put a lot of time and effort into it. We get everything scheduled, coordination, have a copy of the product that they gave me. I mean, everything was signed, sealed, and delivered. And I showed up and 5 minutes go by and no guest. 10 minutes go by, no guest. 15 minutes go by, no guest. Long story made short, never heard from the person again. And initially my reaction was, well, that kind of sucks because I put a lot of time into this. But I realized that if I had an expectation with somebody I didn't know at all, really, I didn't know this person. I knew of this person, right? I had been a fan of this person, so to speak, and followed them on social media, knew about what they promoted. But that's all I had. And so I could have created all of these expectations in my mind that this person, if they were going to reach out to me and send me their product, which there was some cost involved on their end, and I was going to spend all this time that the person would show up. Now, obviously, that was the agreement we had, and this person broke that agreement. So, but my expectation really was not set in stone until it was signed, sealed, and delivered. I've learned enough now to know when you don't know somebody, and I didn't know this person, I knew of this person, but when you don't know somebody, it's unfair, unrealistic, and unhealthy to create expectations around how that person should behave when you don't have any premise for that other than what you see on social media. And I have to remind my coaching clients of this all the time. Social media is not real. And so this was a good opportunity for me to check in with myself and say, how can I make sure that I don't allow this to bother me more than it should because of unrealistic expectations? In other words, I was in control of how I set my expectations and how I responded to the situation. I spent a lot of time, this was a lot of wasted time. Thankfully, I didn't tell a lot of people about it. So, that's partly like the ego thing, especially if somebody lets you down and you had this ego going. So, it's easy to explain to the few people that I told that this was happening that, this person was just a no-show or something came up, and was unable to participate at the agreed upon time, whatever it is, whatever the reason was for this, miscommunication. I made a decision in that moment that I was not going to let it derail me. I could have easily, but I was excited to have this person on my podcast because it was going to provide great content for you. And it's also great exposure overall. But my expectation for this podcast is not that I become rich and famous. My expectation for this podcast is not even that, like I said, you agree with me 100% of the time. My expectation is in my intent, and my intent is to serve you. My intent is to provide value to your life. And so I say this not to point at myself as some great human being that has all these things figured out. If anything, I hope I share enough of my vulnerability with you so that you can see I'm just a regular person trying to figure out life, but I'm willing to share this journey with you in hopes that it helps inspire you to have, just that 1%, as James Clear says in Atomic Habits, that 1% better every day, because that accumulates over time. So the whole reason why I wanted to talk about this is just to say, in this day and age especially, it's so easy to let your expectations drive your happiness. I'll give you another great example of this: politics. I really allowed myself, and I learned from this process, to get sucked into the cesspool, for lack of a better word, that is our presidential, our whole presidential campaign election cycle, I think is the way to say it. Now, I'm not saying that it's not important. Who serves as our president is important, and we should consider this a privilege as Americans that we get the ability to vote, and we should certainly respect the process of democracy. But the reality is, if we look back at this, the way that politics works today is it is primarily an entertainment thing. That doesn't mean that these aren't real decisions, but what I'm saying is because of the role, I should say, that media plays in politics, we oftentimes get caught into the hype and forget that the media makes money on viewership, and the media gets viewership by keeping us emotionally charged. And I know that, which is why I don't watch any news at all whatsoever. And that's something, again, I learned from other coaches and influencers who said, if you want to be happy, stop watching the news. And it's so true. I don't watch the news of any kind. I couldn't, it's not that I couldn't care less, but my mental well-being and my sanity is more important to me than knowing what's going on in the world. And you know what? You don't have to go far to get the news in today's world, to be honest with you. I mean, scroll through any social media platform, and whether you're getting accurate information or not, somebody out there is talking about something that's going on in current events. So if you have FOMO, fear of missing out for not watching the news, I'm just telling you right now, I get it, but I can tell you that you can know what's going on without watching the news. There's another way of doing it, or participating in, media of any kind. So when the whole presidential campaign was going on, it's really easy to get your expectations set up and find yourself constantly disappointed, either by the way a news story portrayed or how the outcome was or whatever it is. And it doesn't matter what side you're on. If you're talking about a debate, how the debate went, it's so easy to find yourself emotionally engaged in this. And this is why it works. This is why elections have become so, such a, I don't know what the right word is, because I don't want to diminish what it is, but it's become a more than just about the real core of the issues, which are how do we best run this country that's that we have. I mean, at the end of the day, what politics should be about are who are the right people and what are the right policies that will lead us into a healthy society. Like that should be the core question we're asking ourselves. But now today, it's who's the most entertaining. It's almost amusing to me to follow politicians on social media because, again, it's weigh your press clippings, don't read them. It's about getting elected is about being famous on social media and all of these things that should be irrelevant to the core issues that we're talking about. But again, expectations of being entertained and the emotion that goes into that often derail us from what really matters. And so this is true, this principle that I'm getting at, which is the principle that expectations, when misplaced, can misplace what we should be focusing on, is really kind of the heart of what I'm getting at. Expectations can be your friend or your enemy depending upon how you use them. Now, I started off by talking about how I started to learn this. And one of the other ways that I learned this as I went on was from listening to and learning it in my coaching curriculum as I learned how to improve my coaching skills. There was a particular coach who talks about expectation versus agreement. And basically saying when you are running a company or in a relationship and it's based on expectation versus based on agreement, what ends up happening in that case scenario is expectations have almost a negative sentiment and connotation associated with it. And so people are operating under this burden of this is my expectation. Where if you flip that paradigm and you operate from a place of agreement, then two people are coming together to agree with one another. And he does a profound job. There's a great YouTube video where he talks about this, and I will put it in the show notes so you can listen to it, because I don't want to take away or diminish from what he said by trying to describe it. I strongly suggest you take the 30 minutes, if you want to listen on 2.0 speed, the 15 minutes it takes to listen to this and have a better understanding of the relationship between expectation and agreement, and how if you stop operating in your relationships from a place of expectation, but rather operate from a place of agreement, everybody wins in that case scenario. And there are many fewer times where we miss the mark because people like to keep their agreements. And we also operate from a healthier place. Now, we can't have that kind of agreement in everything in life because not all of our expectations are about agreements. A lot of them are internal and self-opposed. You go into the self-imposed, not opposed, imposed, excuse me. That was poor articulation. I knew what I was saying. It just didn't come out right. We have expectations we place on ourselves all the time. I expect to lose weight when I go on a diet, right? I expect, when I set my alarm to get up at the time I get up. I want you to stop for a minute and think about what expectations you have with yourself that you don't meet. It's funny because as a coach, I come across this a lot. Everybody expects that when they start the journey, that in a short period of time, they're going to see huge progress. And what's funny about that when I have this conversation with my coaching clients is oftentimes they've made a lot more progress than they realize. It's just that their expectations were different than than really what they should have been. They had unhealthy expectations of themselves or of the process. And then when we stop, we look back and we recalibrate, we realize oftentimes that the expectations that they showed up with were not unrealistic, but maybe the time frame with which they were hoping to accomplish it was unrealistic, or they realized as we go further on the journey that what they started off wanting isn't what they ended up wanting. And so your expectations then become a burden because you're now expecting something while you're going on a different journey. So what I mean by that is you pivot. I'll give you an example. This is just kind of a bizarre example, but it'll help articulate what I just meant. Oftentimes with ultramarathons, you start off with a distance. Many times with ultramarathons in the races is there will be multiple races going on at one time of different distances. So sometimes you might have a race that has a 50K, which is 50 kilometers, 100K, and a 100 miler. And your expectation going into it is that you're going to run whatever distance you signed up for. So I've had this happen before to me. I go into, say, a 100-mile race with the expectation I'm going to run 100 miles. and something somewhere along the way happens. Maybe I get a bad blister, or I fall and I hurt myself, or my nutrition is just off, whatever it is. And I end up dropping down to the 50K. So I changed my course, I changed my decision, but my expectations of myself never realigned with my new goal. And that new goal wasn't a bad thing. The new goal was just recalibrating what was possible with where I was in that moment in time. And so oftentimes we do that in our personal growth journey, is we have expectations of ourselves to be in a certain place. Something comes along and derails us. And then we find ourselves frustrated with our progress when we should be really proud of our progress. Because, even if I had to drop from 100 miles to 50 kilometers, that's still a really far distance to run, right? It's still a massive accomplishment in and of itself. It may not have been what I started off for, but it was still worthy. And there were good reasons why I changed. So I say all this to kind of bring this back to this quote, this thought: act without expectations. Expectation. Think about those expectations I just asked you to think about that you have of yourself. And I want to ask you this question: are your expectations for yourself realistic? Or are you setting yourself up for failure by setting the bar so high that you can do it, but it's not just a stretch, but it's a big step? If you continually set yourself up for failure, you're going to lose motivation really quickly. And this is why I like in James Clear book, Atomic Habits, his concept of small, simple steps. And this is also articulated a lot by Jim Quick in his book, Limitless, and just in his podcast overall. This idea of little wins to keep you motivated, keep you going. And I had to go through this on my own fitness journey. I didn't realize that during COVID, the shift in everything caused me to put on a ton of weight. Like I put on a lot of weight during COVID, and I didn't even realize it because I was working through things I didn't even realize I was working through. And so I had to rebuild my fitness. I'm in the process of rebuilding that. And what's interesting is it would be easy for me to expect to start off with right where I left off, right? Just kind of pick up where I left off. But that would have been an unfair expectation for myself. And if I had tried to get on my bike or tried to go out for a run and do 50 miles like I was able to do, I would have disappointed myself. I would not have met my expectations, and I would have felt like more of a failure than, say, celebrating the fact that I went out and ran 10 miles or whatever the distance is. I'm just using that as an example. So having realistic expectations of yourself or having realistic expectations of a situation allow you to stay motivated and celebrate the small things. It also allows you to have healthier relationships, because there's more room for grace, not only for yourself, but for other people. And I think that's really the heart of act without expectation. It's going into a situation with a mindset to serve. And if that's serving yourself because you're trying to improve yourself, if that's serving the people around you, without expectation, then you will be a happier person. That doesn't mean you become a doormat. That doesn't mean you let people walk all over you. But it means that you give without expecting anything in return. And so then there's nothing to be disappointed about. Another way to think about this, and I was listening earlier today to Jocko Willink and Jordan Peterson. So Dr. Jordan Peterson had Jocko Willink on his podcast, and it was a really fascinating podcast. And Dr. Peterson asked Jocko, what is it that makes a great Navy SEAL? Because Jocko Willink is a former U.S. Navy SEAL. And Jocko, he said, we talk about all these things like really strong swimmer or really good at this, really good at that. He goes, but what really makes somebody a great SEAL is that they put the team above themselves. There's this constant mindset in the SEAL teams that are strong and healthy, that I'm always looking out for my brother. I'm always looking out for the other person. You're always my priority. You first, and then I'll take care of myself. And he said, this is instilled in the SEAL teams early on. And anybody who can't operate in that doesn't last long in the SEAL teams. And I thought that was really profound. And I thought, gosh, how differently would our world operate if everybody operated from that place of, I'm going to take care of you first. I'm going to make sure you're well taken care of. And Dr. Peterson and Jocko elaborate on this. It's a great episode. If you get a chance to listen to it, I strongly encourage you to do that. But they elaborate on on what the world would look like and how so many cultures are toxic as a result of not adopting this mentality. But I think that this is the kind of the heart of expectations, is that the teams and the SEAL teams work so well and they're able to do the things they do because their expectation is that they are taking care of each other first. They're acting without expectation, in other words. So I know I've kind of been all over the board on this because expectations cover a lot of part of our life. We get everything we do is based in some sort of premise of expectation. You sit in a chair expecting it's going to hold your weight. You show up at work expecting you're going to get your paycheck. You get out of bed expecting that you're going to have another full day to live. And sometimes those expectations come shattering around us, either because of our own decisions, because we couldn't get out of our own way, or because somebody else wronged us, or because something just went awry. I mean, I've heard stories of people just walking through the woods and a tree limb falls and knocks them out. There are things, life just happens, and you don't go on a nature walk expecting that a tree is going to hit you, right? But how much differently and how much more peace and joy would we have in our lives if we had fewer expectations? And of the bad kind, not of the good kind. I mean, there's certain, like I said, when you enter into an agreement with somebody, you should expect that they're going to hold up their end of the deal. But how can you expect without being disappointed when things don't always work out the way that they should? It takes practice, like all things. But it first takes awareness. And that's what I love to do in these podcasts is I love just to talk about things that we don't talk about very often, that we don't bring to our awareness very often. And so this is a deep and wide topic, and I could stay on here for 3 hours and talk about every possible scenario, but I want to stop and I want to pause just for a minute. And I know I ask you a question and then I don't give you very much time to answer. So I'm going to pause really. I want you to think of one scenario in your life right now where you have expectations that are not unreasonable per se, but if you let go of the expectation, if you acted without expectation, how would that impact your overall well-being? Just letting go a little bit and giving life a little bit of wiggle room to not be exactly what we expect it to be. Think of that scenario and just imagine how it would be without expectation. Think of a friend that you care for deeply. That is truly a friend. I'm not talking about somebody who's been taking advantage of you. I'm talking about a true friend. How can you serve them without expectation, just with the sheer heart or purpose of or intent of showing up and doing something good for somebody you care about with no expectation in return? How would that feel? How differently would your life be if you looked at the world around you and said, I'm going to give without expecting in return? One of my favorite books that talks about this topic in a slightly different light is The Courage to be Disliked. And I've mentioned this several times. The idea behind The Courage to be Disliked is you do your part and don't worry about other people's part. Show up and be a comrade to the world around you. In other words, be on their team like the Navy SEAL. Look out for their better welfare, but have no expectations of what they're going to do with it because that's their task, not yours. It's another way of looking at it. Separation of tasks is what it's called, which is derived from Adlerian psychology. And Adler was a contemporary of Freud. In my opinion, I tend to lean more towards Adlerian psychology than Freudian psychology. I'm sure that there are many intellectuals that would agree with me, or academics that would agree with me or disagree with me, I mean. But nonetheless, I tend to find more truisms and resonate a little bit more with Adlerian psychology. And that is just simply this understanding of how differently would my life be? How differently would my happiness be if I gave without expecting, if I acted without expectation? Expectation can be used in good ways and it can be used in bad ways. But the only way you mold expectation around how it should be and how it should work is by being intentional about it. So I want to ask you this, and then I'll close. How can you take your expectations that you have right now and weed out the unhealthy expectations that are leading you down a road of disappointment and unhappiness and replace them with healthier expectations, or get rid of them altogether and just expect to give without getting anything in return? How can you take expectations and make them work for you instead of against you? And where can you get rid of expectations and replace them with agreements? think about it. Just chew on it for a little bit. Because I think you'll find that when you start to sort and sift through your expectations, we carry a lot of baggage with them. And I'm inviting you to let go of that. To not let what other people do or how circumstances work out have such an impact on your life that it derails your happiness or your moment or whatever that looks like. There's a lot of freedom on the other side of letting go of unhealthy expectations. And so find those for yourself. Figure out what that looks like to you. But it starts with being aware of expectations. So as I've said a dozen different times, from now, act without expectation. Thank you guys again for tuning in. I really do appreciate it. I love your feedback, your comments, your input. And it really does not only motivate me, inspire me, remind me that I'm achieving my intention, which is to serve you, but it also helps me produce better content for you. So thank you for tuning in. I hope you guys have a wonderful, wonderful day. And again, be sure to tell your friends and family and anybody else that you think would enjoy joining us on this journey. Until next time. Thank you for tuning in. New episodes are released on the second and fourth Monday of every month. If you like this content, please subscribe, leave a review, and tell anyone else you think that will enjoy joining us on this journey to tune in. Until next time.